Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
People are coming out in droves today to make it absolutely clear that Donald Trump is not welcome in our country. I don't think any of us could have believed that a man full of such bile, such hatred, such evil would get his hands on the beacon of freedom in the world.
Some rather strong words about Donald Trump from the now Foreign Secretary David Lammy back in 2018. Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm James Woolcock. Welcome to the programme.
So Keir Starmer has swapped Merseyside for New York this week, attending the United Nations General Assembly. And speaking of Donald Trump, it's reported the former president will meet with the PM at the UN in New York. Starmer will be pleased that Trump is keen to form a working relationship with him, but in a genuinely tight election, the PM will need to tread very carefully. And while we have a reasonable idea of Donald Trump's foreign policy views, some of them predictably unpredictable, just what a Kamala Harris presidency would mean for our relations with the US, well, I think that's altogether less clear. And I think another interesting question is how all of this strutting the world stage plays back home. Now, James, you're also back home from Labour's shindig in Liverpool, aren't you?
I am. Bright, bushy-tailed, bright-eyed. I think there were some interesting lessons when you listen back to that David Lammy clip. In that the now Foreign Secretary was just addressing the UN General Assembly yesterday, and there were, these pro-Palestine activists outside of conference, but it was just a handful. And you have to ask the question, what are the public talking about? Are they bringing up clips from 5 years ago that might make the domestic relationship and the foreign relationship with a future President Trump potentially more difficult? But no, what I experienced at conferences, if you talk to the delegates or the minister's advisors or even people in Liverpool who had nothing to do with the conference, what came up was not Lebanon, was not foreign policy or even Donald Trump, it was winter fuel payments, and it was the issues around donations that kept coming up. So I think the question you have to ask is, how does that square with Keir Starmer's sort of tackling of the domestic agenda? And you look at some of the places he's been visiting, the US, Italy, Germany, Ireland. You can tie that back to migration, to growth, the future of sort of Britain's security, but you also have to have results. And I guess that's what Starmer will have to show from some of these trips in his first 100 days. By my count, he's got 8 now, which is 14 days of the first 100 days. Can he deliver the real goods to match sort of the big trips and sort of itinerary?
Yeah, always a key dilemma for prime ministers, whether they're new or old. Well, let's speak to Ellen Milligan from our politics team, who covers foreign policy for us. Now, Ellen, this is a tricky time for the new PM, isn't it? One or two people is going to be the US president in just over 3 months' time. How does Keir Starmer navigate all of that?
Who the US president is going to be is critical, of course, for leaders around the world, but in particular for Britain. They're the two biggest defence powers in NATO. Britain almost always follows the US's lead on foreign policy decisions, which sometimes puts them in tricky waters domestically. In the last year, for example, we've seen that particularly in relation to how they both handle the conflict in the Middle East. We're seeing that this week with a joint statement from the US, the UK and allies in the EU urging for de-escalation in Lebanon, for example. But it's also tricky because it's no secret that Labour and the Democrats are sister parties. Labour would much rather have a Democrat in the White House. Trump knows this, and that clip that you played from David Lammy is very much coming back to bite the Foreign Secretary, and I'm sure Trump will be aware of it. And in fact, Lammy, interestingly, has done a lot of work to build relations with the Republicans. He's quite chummy with J.D. Vance, Trump's vice presidential pick, for example. In part, you could see it as potential overcompensating for those comments he's previously made, but also genuine efforts because Trump may well be president in just over a month's time. And Starmer and Trump are two very different people. We've heard from Starmer at his speech at Labour Party conference about his desire to govern with a patient, calm leadership style. I don't think it's unfair to say that Trump's leadership style represents the exact opposite of patient and calm. And I don't think that Starmer has met either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump in person before, although he did have a phone call with Trump following the assassination attempt in July, just a week or so after Starmer became Prime Minister. So clearly an effort has been made to build relations.
We know Joe Biden's views on foreign policy and Donald Trump's as well. But Kamala Harris, do we have any clues about what she might mean for UK-US relations?
She's not really spoken about this, so we don't have a clear view of what her stance is on UK-US relations, but there's expectation in Starmer's administration that she'll oversee a continuation of Biden's outlook on that. So a more protectionist trade policy, uninterested, for example, in a UK-US trade deal that's seen little prospect of happening for a while now. Talks have never got going on that. She will be also more aligned with, obviously, Biden's administration on Israel and Ukraine, which I think in particular for Ukraine is what Britain and other, allies, including Zelensky, are particularly worried about, which is depleting support for Ukraine if Trump comes in, saying that the US and the UK are still being asked by Ukraine, and it's not just the US and UK, it's the EU as well, to properly support them through this winter and through next year. It's kind of getting to crunch time as we go into the cold months as to whether Ukraine has the ammunition and the weapons it needs. Zelensky is at Unger as well, urging Biden and Starmer to allow him to use British Storm Shadows to strike inside Russia. We're not expecting a decision on that this week, which I think means that the US is holding out on that, whereas the UK is more supportive of allowing them to. So there's a lot of things still up in the air on Ukraine, and I think a Kamala Harris administration will give people a lot of peace of mind over that.
Well, you mentioned the EU there. We know that Prime Minister Starmer is off to Brussels next week to meet the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. Now, we started at the very top of this conversation, Ellen, talking about foreign policy is all well and good, but it has to deliver practical changes that British people can feel if it's going to boost some of these sort of dismal poll ratings Starmer is seeing. Is the EU going to give Britain anything practical from some of these talks?
Yeah, he's off to Brussels next week, and we've been expecting this since he became Prime Minister, but the UK and the EU obviously wanted to wait until von der Leyen had picked her commission. What I'm told from EU diplomats is that they're quite shocked that Labour has appeared to slap down their proposal for a youth mobility deal, which would enable EU and UK students to study in their respective universities more easily, have lower tuition fees, those kinds of things, rejoin Erasmus. And my understanding from the EU is that the UK needs to show that it's willing to negotiate some kind of youth mobility deal in order to unlock talks, for example, on a security pact that the UK has put in its manifesto, a SPS deal, which, to translate, that is a deal to kind of unstick the physical checks on fresh product, food and drink, for example, at the border in the UK and in the EU. I think the EU is open to actually doing these kinds of deals. A security pact, for example, was offered by Barnier, and Johnson rejected it in favour of AUKUS a few years ago. An SPS deal has been suggested by the EU before, for example, and it was rejected. So I think these things are all doable, but it means that the UK needs to show some leg on the youth mobility deal that the EU wants. And also, I think there's a lot of expectation that there's a limited window to be able to do this. You need to use the momentum going into the new year to get these talks done. If they drag on too long, the EU is going to lose interest. There's more important things at play: Ukraine, the Middle East, their own domestic issues with depleting competition against China and the US. So it's all positive noises, but there's a lot that the UK needs to get right in terms of not giving too much, but not being so opposed to what the EU also wants.
Yeah, showing a bit of leg. Very difficult for Keir Starmer, all those domestic red lines on European policy. Ellen, thanks so much for your thoughts. Ellen Milligan from our politics team, who covers foreign policy for us.
Let's bring in Evie Aspinall, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. So, Evie, we've been discussing this link between Starmer's foreign policy and whether it can deliver sort of concrete, achievable policy objectives at home. Is this trip to the UN an exercise in statesmanship, or are there clear, concrete sort of achievements Starmer can make there?
I think first and foremost, it's an exercise of statesmanship. But there is also opportunities for the UK to make some real progress there, particularly around UK-EU relations. I think that's his real target, is to kind of strengthen relations. That's a top priority for Starmer. There's also a kind of a big challenge around Ukraine, around the Middle East, that, it's really important for the UK that Starmer makes a very clear stance at this point in time, ahead of a very turbulent kind of geopolitical time at the moment.
Now, Evie, you've done a recent study into public opinion on a lot of foreign affairs issue, really interesting stuff. And there's increased public support for more aid to Gaza and, to a lesser extent, suspending arms sales to Israel. Just talk to us about the evolution of public opinion on the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So public opinion has really shifted over the last year on the Middle East. Kind of after October 7th, we saw significant kind of sympathy and support for Israel. And while there's still definitely, belief that, in the need to return hostages, etc., there is growing concern among the public around the humanitarian situation in Palestine, around the potential escalation, and a real desire for the UK to make sure that it's got a humanitarian first approach, so that it's really leading with support and aid for Gaza as kind of the top priority.
So I was doing some kind of very short hand-nosed calculations, Evie. I reckon Starmer's done about 8 foreign trips so far as being Prime Minister, this one being his 8th today. And if he goes to Brussels next week, that'll be 9. That's about 14 days of his sort of big first 100 days. That's quite a lot of time. What does he have to gain from sort of these big trips? Why is he spending his time as the Prime Minister doing them?
I think first and foremost it's that we're in very challenging political times. But particularly, there's kind of a concern about potential Trump presidency in the United States, and a desire, therefore, for Starmer to kind of draw up support for Ukraine, particularly, and before that potential for Trump presidency comes in. So it's sort of seen as a critical juncture ahead of a Trump presidency. And also because UK-EU relations was quite high on the agenda in the election in relative foreign policy terms, I think one of the big ambitions around growth that they're hoping will be achieved by strengthening relations with the EU. And so from the start, he wanted to make clear that, the EU is back at the top of the UK's agenda. And that's why that's been so at the forefront in the first couple of months.
I want to talk to you about money. Money's never far away from things and the lack of it. The House of Lords report out today says that 2.5% of GDP on defence may not be enough. That's already a struggle for the government to get there. How does the public feel about throwing more money at defence?
So it's really interesting. When the top level, we see 71% of Britain support increasing defence spending to 2.5% over either now or in the next few years. So that seems relatively high. But when you dig into it, there's actually significant opposition in many of the trade-offs. So we, for example, very recently polled on whether they would support increasing defence spending if it meant spending less on the NHS, education or welfare. And actually, in all three circumstances, Britons oppose increasing defence spending. So I think one of the real challenges is actually Britons don't want to increase defence spending in the current environment if it's going to require trade-offs elsewhere, which in practice, unless you increase taxes, which again the public oppose, they're not going to be able to increase defence spending without actually alienating a lot of the public by decreasing spending elsewhere.
If you were to compare this administration, Evie, and I appreciate early days, to the previous one, what are the key areas that have changed? Because on a lot of areas, it feels like there aren't that many changes. Like take Ukraine, for example. There are big similarities between the two administrations.
Yeah, definitely. I think the kind of big change has been around the EU. I think that's where we've seen the biggest shift, much more support for closer cooperation. But actually also on Israel and Palestine, we started to see a shift. And I think in the next couple of months, we'll see a further shift to a kind of a more pro-humanitarian, particularly pro-Palestine approach, which at the very least is more overtly critical of kind of the humanitarian situation in Gaza at the very least.
And you had some interesting findings on people's views towards the European Union, even amongst Leave voters, broad support for working with other European countries. Yeah,
absolutely. It's really interesting. Especially over the last year, we've seen support for cooperation with the EU substantially increasing. And across the board, even among Leave voters, you're seeing sort of between 50% to 70% supporting a wide range of cooperation, from reducing trade barriers to tackling regular migration. And also, crucially, where Britons are willing to make some of the trade-offs. There's been lots of talk about an EU-US mobility programme. Actually, the public are very happy with that if it means that we increase trade relations. I think there's a lot of scope and opportunity, be it from security to trade, for the UK government to increase cooperation with the EU, and there's a lot of public support for that now.
really interesting stuff, that there is these shifting public opinions both on Israel-Gaza, on defence spending, and also that how Labour's stance towards the EU is very different to the previous government. Thank you very much, Evie Aspinall, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, for joining us on the podcast.
Really interesting stuff. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Rastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Yuan. We'll be back with more next week. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.